So, Graham, we were just talking about the firepower that you would, in the event of contact, you just hit it with everything you could and then do a withdrawal.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you're in the jungle or in the bamboo or in this area, or even in open savanna, how do you make contact and then you've got to withdraw? It's not the easiest thing because you're withdrawing under fire.
We used the fire and movement technique,
Yeah.
and we had a rendezvous point. If anybody got separated, whatever, we would go to that rendezvous point and wait till everybody joined up.
Yeah.
But we had I think it's a series of mathematics based on threes.
Yep.
You had basically 3 minutes to break contact, probably 30 minutes to get clear and of where you were and probably get out within another 30 minutes, depending on whether they chased you or not.
Yeah.
But in a lot of cases, I think they were just simply too demoralised. When they were set up on their own, they were formidable soldiers.
Yeah.
And I mean formidable.
Yeah.
But the point is, we caught them with their pants down.
Okay.
And I think it had a psychological effect there too.
Yeah.
One good example that happened with one squadron, they grabbed this woman who was a water carrier, grabbed her and the bucket, put the bucket on the ground, left it there and took her with them. Now, when they came and all they would have found was the bucket.
Okay.
Nothing else.
Yeah.
Might have been a few footprints and whatever, but the psychological impact of that would have been extraordinary.
Yeah, psych ops. So just thinking, what happened, or
what happened?
These
did she happen?
Phantoms of the jungle have taken the water carrier,
and if they would pursue you, and their whole problem was they never had anybody to hang their hat on. They never had a body.
Yes.
They never had a success. They might find a few cartridge cases and whatever, and they'd find their own dead, but there'd be nothing else.
So over time, that would have a demoralising effect. The other thing is that you would imagine that there could have been a price on some people's heads, or they would really want to turn that around.
I would have thought their whole idea would, if they got somebody, would have paraded them through the various villages and what have you.
Yeah.
And say, look what we've got. But
Yeah.
they never had that opportunity.
Yeah. Well, it says a lot that no one was captured. Or
and we were fairly lucky. We had no killed in action. We had a couple of accidental deaths.
Yeah.
One as a result of encephalitis from a monkey bite.
Oh, goodness gracious.
And a couple of minor wounds, but there was not just minor. One chap lost his legs, and another fella died of wounds.
Oh.
He died back in Australia.
Oh, no.
But we didn't have anybody killed in action, and they had nobody that they could say, well, we got one.
No. I think that's the thing about warfare, is that a lot of it is psychological, isn't it?
Well, it is. And like the ambushes in themselves, I don't think any troop soldier of any calibre can react initially. I don't care how well trained they are, how aggressive they are.
Yeah.
You've got two choices. You try and assault the ambush or you run.
Yeah.
And that's like we used to use somewhere between, we would use 6 Claymore mines.
Okay.
We normally had a 10-man fighting patrol.
Okay.
2 M60 machine guns, plus the appropriate small arms.
Yeah.
And the initial noise was absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
It had stripped the foliage off the trees. Well, 8 claymores going off, or 8 or 6 going off was horrendous.
Well, I don't know how many little ball bearings.
700.
God.
And then you had the firepower of all the weapons involved, which all fire at once.
Yeah.
Then you'd stop, reload, and just listen. If there was anybody still alive, sometimes they'd throw a couple of hand grenades to see if they could pinpoint someone
Okay.
where they were. But it was a horrific thing. There was just this enormous bang, and roar of fire, and you could smell all the foliage that had been shredded.
Gee, but I mean, so that when you'd go out on an ambush, there'd be a 10-man unit.
Generally,
reconnaissance would be a smaller
5.
5. Okay. So when you'd go out in reconnaissance, like how much did you carry a radio set with you?
Carried 2 radios.
2 radios. One was a backup, or
one was a primary, one was a Morse code method of communication, and the other one was a standard FM radio.
Yeah. And were they heavy, and were they?
They were heavy
and reliable.
They were quite good. You had to carry extra batteries with them.
Yeah.
But the trouble was, we then had to distribute some of the weight amongst the rest of the patrol because the radio took up so much in the pack.
Yeah, you wouldn't have much
room.
left. Yeah.
So we would pass this and that around, and people would carry extra ammo or carry the mines or do whatever.
So then, would it rely on the aerial that you'd have to have? Like, if you're in the jungle, would you still get a signal?
Well, we mainly used the standard radio for ground-to-air communication.
Okay. Yeah.
And for our normal communication, we used Morse code and one-time letter pad.
Oh, right on.
Because it was far more reliable.
Good old Morse code.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the one of the controversies around Vietnam was the Hearts and Minds program and the way the Americans conducted that, and they're trying to create these little hamlets and help them defend themselves. Obviously, that the South Vietnamese army, which apparently had 750,000 at one stage. I don't know if that's the right figures. So it was a very complicated situation, and I guess it was always hard to work out if that person...
it was a civil war.
Yeah.
It was a civil war that was aided by the great powers of the world.
Yeah.
It nearly broke Russia.
Yeah.
Supplying, and China.
Yeah.
Supplying the South Vietnamese, or the North Vietnamese in general.
But they could never have conducted the operations or kept things going without that supply in the Ho Chi Minh. It was all about supply, resupply, and keep them fed in the field, keep them equipped.
And they kept drafting. I think they were down to drafting 16-year-olds. Yeah. And they used to have a tattoo. Some of them would be born in the north to die in the south.
Right on.
And they marched them all down the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
So did they have the political officers like the NKVD in the Second World War?
Very similar.
So if you didn't perform, they'd execute them.
They did that to everybody.
Yeah.
They were terribly cruel people.
Yeah.
Some of the things that they managed to do defy description, and the fact that the press... Hue was a good example.
Yeah.
When they went into Hue, they had and they used school children to take them to these houses. They had a list of who was to be taken. Yeah. And they went around, they arrested them all, they took them away, and then proceeded to say they were being taken to re-education camps, and they killed them all, buried them alive, beat their heads in when they ran out of bullets. And
now, was Hue where they had the big battle in the Tet Offensive?
It was, yeah.
So there was an incredible brutality on the part of the commissars there when they came in, and they, obviously, being a Marxist-Leninist or Maoist, they wanted to get rid of the bourgeoisie and the teachers and the religious. I think they went for them as well.
But I don't think it's a silly thing. It was so deliberate.
Yeah.
But the press at the time basically refused to follow up the story. Mm-hmm. There were some who did, showing the bodies being extricated from the
Yeah.
ground and whatever, but it never made the
Yeah,
headlines that it should have.
I read a book on it, and the performance of the U.S. Marines there and their heroism and how they held on. I don't know how they did it, but it was some great leadership there, and obviously I think there was South Vietnamese troops there as well. They ported themselves very well, but the brutality of it on the civilians, and yeah, it just someone like a civilian like me, it's hard to just imagine what it would be like, you know.
Well, in most cases, I think if you're a soldier, you can understand.
Yeah.
But you don't understand how vicious a civil war is, and how, like in Cambodia, a lot of the leaders of the death squads there were 12-year-old girls.
Really?
Yeah, and they were far worse than the men.
In the killing fields and
One of their pet things was to tie their hands up, put a paper bag over their head and kick them into the rice paddies.
Oh my goodness.
And that's what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
People don't understand communism. Mm-hmm. Communism is the end justifies the means. No matter what you do, provided you win, you've justified what you've done.
And that's Lenin's, based on Lenin's theory. And of course, the fascinating thing was that the Germans brought Lenin back to Russia in 1917, and here we are. We're still talking about communism today.
Repeating itself.
Yeah, you're talking about the media. By the time of Wayne, that there was a big anti-war movement in the United States, and I guess sometimes they talk about a narrative, an ideological narrative today as well. But back then, if the narrative showed the North Vietnamese commissars or political officers to be so cruel and heartless and just similar to the NKVD in the Second World War, or the Gestapo and the Nazi, it wouldn't have suited the argument that they're watching back in the United States or back in Australia, which probably comes to the next question. It's the war was very controversial. There was a lot of animosity towards service people, and the stories are that when the Australian servicemen and women, I suppose, that came back, they were spat on and treated very poorly, and there seemed to be an anti-military era where even Anzac Day and that was sort of not a bit off key, and even I suppose today you can see with recent history with some of the media campaigns against the SAS and the commandos and what they had to do and how they did things. It just seems you can sort of draw connections, I think.
With the Vietnam War, there was a massive influx of Russian money and individuals to permeate the problem in the universities, and that in America and probably everywhere else.
Yeah.
Their propaganda machine was functioning all over the world, not just in the States, and in Europe, France, where a lot of Vietnamese had dual citizenship.
Yeah, well, so Ho Chi Minh was a cook or a chef in Paris, I believe.
But they had dual citizenship, and they didn't have to serve.
Oh.
You could live in Vietnam, provided you had dual citizenship, you weren't called up.
Oh, really?
Which made a division within the population of its own, because they were living probably a successful life, had no thoughts. They're quite likely to drive down the road, and if you were walking to work, they'd jump out of the Jeep and grab you and throw you in the back. And you were gone, and nobody knew where you'd gone, or until somebody decided to say, well, I'm in the army now.
Okay, that's being recruited to the French army and Indochina?
In the Vietnamese army.
The South Vietnamese army? Okay, yeah.
They'd drive down the road and pick out a likely candidate and jump up and grab him, and
of course,
they were gone.
The controversy, I suppose, there was also the coup that was orchestrated, they believe, by the CIA against the president of South Vietnam.
Yeah.
And that was pretty controversial, and as to why they did that and so forth. But and then Westmoreland would like, he's an interesting character in himself. Like he was promising the war be over in 2 years, which is sort of familiar to more recent times in Afghanistan and Iraq. But then at a point after the Tet Offensive in '68, when you were over there, they seemed to the Tet was a defeat for the North Vietnamese with the amount of casualties. But then you kind of go, it seemed to create a demoralization.
It came out as a victory for them rather than they suffered a massive defeat.
Yeah.
That the Viet Cong basically was destroyed in the Tet Offensive.
Yeah.
After that, they started to fill those units up with North Vietnamese officers and ORs, and they were thinking then how far ahead they were when they took the South, that if the Viet Cong didn't like it, and they don't like one another.
Really?
The North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese. And the North Vietnamese see themselves as a very disciplined, hard-working group, and the mob in the South, they're like a bunch of lotus eaters who live the good life without the cold and and
the French influence and all that sort of thing.
So, were there to be a revolt in the South, if they didn't like the policies of the North, they would be in a position to crush those units or control them.
So they had,
because the hierarchy and the senior NCOs and whatever were all North Vietnamese, and a lot of them were very hardened North Vietnamese.
Yeah. I mean, obviously they had the earlier Indochina War with the French and Dien Bien Phu, which was militaristically seemed to be a big victory for them and for General Giap.
What it was.
And that was, what year was that? Was that 56?
54.
54, yeah. So 10 years later, 12 years later, you're arriving on the scene. But some of those NVA regulars,
they'd been fighting all along.
They were probably coming down and infiltrating. And
we killed a bloke there one day. He was quite an older man, would have been in his 50s.
Yep.
And he had a French waterproof watch on.
Really?
Mm.
So he'd either bought it or he'd got it at the end.
He got it off some dead Frenchman, but that's what it was.
But the other thing about the NBN Phu, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, there's a lot of Germans there, ex-German Wehrmacht.
They were.
But amazing what they achieved there. But getting back to the whole Vietnam and the controversy thing, obviously it was the Cold War, and you had the dominoes theory that we're not going to let anywhere, if we let these, whether it's Indonesia or Malaya or Vietnam, if they fold, they'll keep coming. They want to rule the world. That's their ideological drive, that they want to rule the world. So we're having to put a stake in the ground here in Vietnam, and we're going to take them on. Korea was similar.
Very similar.
So
they had the Jim Jams after what MacArthur did to bring the Chinese into the war. Theoretically, the tactics would have been to cut off North Vietnam below China.
Yeah.
The Chinese weren't going to have an American army on their border.
Yeah.
That's the long and short of the tactics.
With Korea?
No, with with North Vietnam. Had they tried to push across, say, from Hanoi and Haiphong across to Laos, which probably would have been the thing to do, to cut the country off in the north and then clean up down in the south. They wouldn't have had the Chinese wouldn't have allowed an American army on their border.
But that's the similarity with Korea, because once they moved north and was pretty successful, then the Chinese said, this isn't, we're not happy with this, and then massive troop movements came in, and then there was that withdrawal.
There were all kinds of people in the Vietnam War. I saw a thing in one of the papers where they had a reunion of the Russian veterans of the Vietnam War.
Really?
In Moscow. Would have been in the 80s, 90s, somewhere there. Yeah. They had thousands of troops deployed in the South Vietnam.
Yeah.
With their missile batteries and mechanics and lines of communication troops. Yeah. And when the invasion started, got off properly, they put 250,000 troops into North Vietnam to handle the railways.
250,000?
Yeah, all the bits and pieces that it took, so those troops could be released. And the North Vietnamese troops could be released to take up their role in the in the invasion of the South.
And then the Chinese, the Russians could claim politically, or we don't have any people.
We don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
But I've always claimed that.
Well, in a similar sense, in you had a similar situation happening in Cuba, 1960, around that time. Then it's in Africa, with Angola, all those countries. So
Rhodesia, the whole lot.
Yeah, so it was happening all over the world, and I think that's, 40, 50 years later, people have to understand the context of the time. But now, there's also some interesting things with the growth of China, and and Russia, I suppose, are adopting a more aggressive approach.
Well, I think the Cold War started in 1945 and never finished.
Yeah.
What it has done is gone in peaks and hollows.
But the Berlin Wall was the end of it, wasn't it?
It's gone on. It's gone on. When they took it on the road to North Africa, they took it on the road to Rhodesia.
Yeah.
And look what happened to that. It was one of the flowers of Africa.
Yeah.
It was a totally self-supporting nation.
Yeah.
And what is it now?
It's not in great shape.
No, it's not in great shape at all. So what did they achieve?
That's the question, isn't it? So if we look at Vietnam through the lens of history and time, you would say, I'm thinking, that the domino effect was a valid political argument, and the actions of US troops and Australian troops and South Korean troops were valid to try and hold off the,
I believe so,
the communist expansion.
I wouldn't be convinced otherwise.
Yeah.
It mightn't have been the most popular thing, but the point being, it's very difficult. If you're going to send troops off to war, it's the government sends you.
Yeah.
The population shouldn't. I'm not saying they shouldn't have an opinion on it.
Yeah.
But don't turn on the people who are doing the job.
Yeah.
And most of the people who objected and got involved in this touchy-feely push and shove, they had no opportunity of ever being drafted as long as their backsides pointed to the ground.
Yeah.
And Dick Cheney is the greatest example of that in the world. He avoided the draft on 5 occasions, the last one getting married, and became one of the greatest hawks that's ever been.
Yeah, the neocons.
And I just think that's absolutely disgusting.
Well, that was the time of the Bush presidencies, and Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz was another, and they were, the neocons. They seemed to want to create warfare in the Middle East, and then some people now say, "Oh well, that's just to create, that's just for the support the military-industrial complex and create more war, more income." And some people will have that attitude about Ukraine at the moment. 100 billion from the US and whatever we've sent in Australian dollars, that's going to perpetuate war, but someone's making money on it.
Well, one of the interesting points is that the Russians failed in Afghanistan.
Yep.
Because of the amount of equipment and that they'd sent off to Indochina.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
They were still struggling from that.
There's no doubt about it. You can only turn out, somebody's got to pay something somewhere.
Yeah. I think, and this is where Reagan came in. and he was quite bolshy about it, and he just wanted to take him on, and they couldn't match dollar for dollar, and it just seemed to bankrupt them. But even though you might say the end of the Berlin was the communism was over, but it's not over. It's as you say, it's the ideology is still going, and I guess that takes us to the common time we live in, and it does seem that in certain very influential parts of our society in Australia or in Britain or in the United States that they don't seem to take warmly to anything to do with the military. And you get terms like toxic masculinity and patriarchy. And they seem to be more interested in, marginalized people and victimized people. But I'd be interested in how you see that, given your life experiences and the people that you knew had perished in Long Tan, the people you'd served with, and all those experiences.
Well, generally speaking, I wouldn't regret 1 minute of it. The major thing that I would say to anybody, it's a dirty business.
Yeah.
And unless you're prepared to accept the dirty business with the other, you haven't got much chance of beating anybody, because the Chinese or whatever, they will do whatever is necessary to be done.
Yeah.
And you've only got to look at the difference between, I saw a Russian recruiting program.
Yeah, I think I've seen that
and
one.
The one with the woman with the two mothers.
Yeah, it was a bit of a contrast, that one.
And like it is, nobody can.
I think I'm joining the Russian army. I think a better chance of survival.
I'm not saying anybody's experiences are any better or any worse than what it is.
Yeah.
But if you have a look at that business yesterday, 82 Russians killed by that missile.
Yeah.
They could have been the finest soldiers. It could have been anything.
Yeah.
They were all sons and daughters of parents.
Yeah.
And that's a couple of missiles achieved.
Yeah.
That.
Yeah.
In this modern day and age. And the other thing is, there'll be no more convoys in the future. There won't be a boat get out of wherever. Or if it does, it's not going to go very far.
No, well, you've seen what happened in Ukraine with the Russian convoys. They got destroyed. And
you'll go to war with what you got.
Yeah.
And we haven't got enough ammunition in this country to last for 4 days.
Well, yeah, that's a point I've heard before. I've heard it'll take us within 2 weeks, 4 days. We run out of artillery stuff. Then we won't have to wait for the Yanks to resupply us, which is a bit of a worry, because Australia's been through this before.
Well, they're running out of ammunition now. Every country that uses comparison American ammunition is being asked to send ammunition to the Ukraine.
Yeah,
we had that happen in Afghanistan with the Bushmaster cannon.
Yeah,
they ran out of ammunition. The Americans couldn't manufacture it fast enough, so they started to buy it back from the countries that has that particular type of vehicle.
Wow.
Now the Chinese are sending ammunition to Russia. The North Koreans are sending ammunition to Russia.
And Iran.
Yeah, so the point is that you come with what you got, and I think the Russians are starting to run out.